Welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most brilliant narrative puzzles in Five Nights at Freddy's history. A mystery that had the entire community searching for answers for years, only to discover that the solution was hiding in plain sight the entire time, just not in the way anyone expected. The Bite of 87. Those three words have echoed through the FNAF community since the very first game dropped back in 2014. Phone Guy's casual mention of this horrific incident became the franchise's most enduring mystery, sparking countless theories, heated debates, and desperate hunts for clues that seemed to lead nowhere. Everyone wanted to know which animatronic did it, who the victim was, and what exactly happened on that fateful day in 1987. Then came FNAF 4 in July 2015, and Scott Cawthon did something that absolutely nobody saw coming. He didn't give us the straightforward answer we were begging for. Instead, he showed us something completely different, something that initially felt like a betrayal, like he was trolling the entire fanbase. But here's the thing that makes this story so fascinating. FNAF 4 actually did solve the Bite of 87 mystery. It just solved it in the most unexpected, brilliant way possible. By showing us a completely different bite incident from 1983, Scott gave us every single piece of information we needed to finally understand what really happened 4 years later in 1987. This isn't just a story about solving a video game mystery. It's a masterclass in indirect storytelling, in trusting your audience's intelligence, in creating narrative depth that rewards patience and careful analysis. It's about how sometimes the answer you're looking for isn't found by looking directly at it, but by examining the context, the patterns, the shadows it casts across everything else. Whether you're a long-time FNAF fan who lived through the chaos of FNAF 4's release and remembers the community meltdown when that 1983 date appeared on screen, or you're newer to the franchise and want to understand how one of gaming's greatest mysteries was actually solved, or you're simply letting these words wash over you as you drift towards sleep, this is the complete story of how FNAF 4 secretly solved the Bite of 87. Before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into gaming mysteries and narrative analysis, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. And drop a comment about your own theories or memories of when you first discovered this connection. The FNAF community has always been built on shared discovery and discussion, and I love hearing different perspectives on these pivotal moments in the franchise's history. Now, let's start where it all began, with a phone call that would haunt players for years to come. The mystery of the Bite of 87 began with a single line of dialogue that every FNAF player immediately recognizes. It's your first night working at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, sometime in November 1993, based on the paycheck you receive at the end of the week. Phone Guy is walking you through the basics of your new position as a night security guard, explaining why the animatronics behave the way they do. His tone is casual, almost friendly, like he's just another employee trying to help you survive your first week on the job. He's talking about the animatronics' free roaming mode, explaining how their servos will lock up if they stay in one place for too long, so they're programmed to walk around at night. The explanation seems reasonable, almost mundane, just a quirk of the technology. But then Phone Guy drops a piece of information that would captivate the entire fan base for years. They used to be allowed to walk around during the day too, he says, and there's a subtle shift in his tone. But then there was the Bite of 87. There's a pause, just brief enough to let that statement sink in, to let the horror of what he's implying settle into your mind. Then he continues, and what he says next makes it so much worse. Yeah, It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe, you know. And just like that, he moves on to discussing your safety protocols, as if he hadn't just casually mentioned someone losing a significant portion of their brain to an animatronic attack during operating hours at a family restaurant. The genius of this moment lies in everything Phone Guy doesn't say. He never tells you which animatronic was responsible. He doesn't describe what happened in detail. He doesn't mention who the victim was or what became of them beyond losing their frontal lobe. He simply states it as historical fact, as company history that led to policy changes. The animatronics used to roam freely during the day, interacting with customers, being part of the family-friendly atmosphere that made Freddy Fazbear's Pizza special. But after the bite of '87, that privilege was permanently revoked. That casual, matter-of-fact tone is what made the bite of '87 feel so real and so disturbing. Phone Guy wasn't telling you a scary story or trying to frighten you. He was referencing actual company history, an incident that fundamentally changed how Fazbear Entertainment operated. The restraint in his description, the way he doesn't linger on the horror, actually makes it more unsettling. This is normalized workplace discussion. This is just another incident in the long, troubled history of a company that's seen far too many tragedies. But that specific detail about the frontal lobe is what really captured everyone's imagination and wouldn't let go. The frontal lobe isn't just another body part. It's crucial for personality, decision-making, voluntary movement, and higher cognitive functions. It's fundamentally connected to who you are as a person. Phone Guy's amazement that someone could survive without it speaks volumes about the severity of the injury. This wasn't a minor incident. This was catastrophic brain damage, the kind of trauma that should have been immediately fatal. The medical implications are staggering when you really think about it. For someone to lose their frontal lobe and survive means the bite would have had to be positioned with almost surgical precision. The frontal lobe sits right behind your forehead, so we're talking about an animatronic jaw clamping down on the front of someone's skull, with enough force to crush through bone and remove brain tissue. But somehow not destroying the brainstem or causing enough hemorrhaging to kill the victim instantly. The physics and mechanics of such an injury became a subject of intense debate in the community. This detail would become absolutely crucial later in solving the mystery, though in 2014, when the first game released, players were focused on different questions entirely. Who did it? The obvious suspect was Foxy, lurking behind his curtain in Pirate Cove with that out-of-order sign that seemed like damning evidence of being decommissioned after a dangerous incident. Was it one of the main stage performers? Freddy, Bonnie, or Chica? And perhaps most intriguingly, who was the victim? Was it a child attending a birthday party, an employee, another security guard like you? Phone Guy's vague reference left absolutely everything open to interpretation, which is exactly what made it such an effective mystery. The fact that this incident occurred specifically in 1987 was also significant, though players didn't immediately understand why. The first game takes place in 1993, 6 years after the bite. That's enough time for the incident to have faded from immediate public consciousness, become part of company lore rather than breaking news, but still recent enough that employees discuss it, that it actively shapes operational policies, that the damage to Fazbear Entertainment's reputation still lingers in ways that affect how they do business. The bite of '87 was positioned as a turning point in the franchise's history, the moment when whatever innocence remained at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was lost forever. Before the bite, animatronics could walk around freely, interact with guests, create that magical experience of dining with living cartoon characters. After the bite, that dream was dead. The robots were restricted, contained, treated as the dangerous machines they actually were beneath their friendly exteriors. And then there's the question of why Phone Guy knows so much about it, why he can reference it so casually. His tone suggests personal familiarity, not just second-hand knowledge from training videos or company memos that he had to memorize. The way he says, "It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe," has a quality of genuine wonder to it, as if he witnessed the aftermath personally, as if he saw the victim and couldn't believe they were still alive. Did Phone Guy work at the location where the bite occurred? Was he there that day? Was he somehow involved in the events that led to the tragedy? The games never explicitly confirm this, but the implication hangs in the air throughout FNAF 1, adding another layer of mystery to Phone Guy's character and his relationship to the dark history of Fazbear Entertainment. He knows too much to be a casual observer. He's been around too long, seen too much. His phone calls become more unsettling when you realize he survived incidents that killed others, that he's complicit in a system that prioritizes corporate interests over human safety. The timing of when Phone Guy mentions the bite is also narratively perfect. It's night 1, the very first phone call, within the opening minutes of the game. Scott Cawthon establishes the core mystery immediately, plants this seed of horror that will grow in players' minds as they progress through increasingly difficult nights. Every time an animatronic gets too close, every time Foxy sprints down the hallway toward your office, every time Freddy's laugh echoes in the darkness, you're thinking about what those jaws could do to your skull. You're imagining the bite of 87 playing out with you as the victim. This single line of dialogue became the foundation for countless theories, analysis videos, Reddit megathreads, and community discussions that would span years. People dissected every frame of FNAF 1, looking for clues. They examined the animatronics designs for signs of bloodstains, damage, or modifications that might indicate one of them had been involved in a serious incident. They created elaborate timelines, trying to figure out when the bite occurred, relative to other events in the franchise, trying to map out Fazbear Entertainment's complete operational history. The mystery consumed the fanbase in a way that few video game plot points ever have. Part of what made it so effective was the perfect balance of specific and vague information. We knew exactly what happened in broad strokes. An animatronic bit someone's frontal lobe off during the day in 1987, but we didn't know the crucial details that would actually solve the mystery. It's like being given a puzzle with half the pieces missing. You can see the general shape of what it should be, the outline of the image, but you can't complete the picture no matter how hard you try. Here's something that many people don't fully appreciate even now, years later. This single line of dialogue influenced the entire direction of the franchise going forward. FNAF 2, which released later in 2014, was specifically designed to explore the year 1987 more directly, to give players more context about when and how the bite might have occurred. The introduction of the toy animatronics with their advanced mobility and facial recognition systems, the emphasis on the restaurant being open during the day with children present, the specific mention that Jeremy Fitzgerald would be working a day shift after night 6. All of this was Scott providing more pieces to the puzzle, giving the community more evidence to analyze. But here's the thing, and this is crucial for understanding Scott's approach to storytelling. He was being very careful not to give away the answer too easily. FNAF 2's gameplay ends before any bite occurs. We don't see it happen. We're left to infer from context clues, from Phone Guy's increasingly worried messages about investigations and possible tampering, from the implications of Jeremy working that birthday party day shift. The mystery deepens rather than resolves, which only made the community more obsessed with finding the truth. The Bite of 87 became more than just a plot point. It became a symbol of everything that made FNAF storytelling so uniquely compelling. The restraint, the hidden lore scattered across multiple games, the trust that players would fill in the gaps with their own theories and interpretations. Phone Guy's casual mention of this horrific incident perfectly encapsulated Scott Cawthon's narrative philosophy. Give players just enough information to be disturbed, intrigued, and desperate for more, but never so much that the mystery loses its power, never so much that there's nothing left to discover. Looking back now with the benefit of hindsight and multiple games' worth of accumulated lore, that first mention of the Bite of 87 feels even more significant than it did in 2014. It wasn't just setting up a mystery to be solved in a future game. It was establishing that the world of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is one where terrible things happen regularly, where children and adults alike are endangered by entertainment that's supposed to be innocent and fun, where a company will continue operating despite tragedy after tragedy, because profit matters more than safety or human life. The Bite of 87 told us in a single sentence that this franchise was going to be different from other horror games. The scares weren't just about jump scares and creepy animatronics. They were about the horror of institutional failure, of tragedies that get swept under the rug, of victims whose stories are reduced to vague workplace anecdotes that get mentioned casually during training calls. Phone Guy's tone when discussing someone losing their frontal lobe is itself horrifying in a way that's more subtle, but somehow more disturbing than any jump scare could ever be. It's the banality of evil, the normalization of tragedy in a corporate environment. And so, the hunt began in earnest. Players armed with theories, determination, and an encyclopedic knowledge of every detail in the game set out to solve the mystery that Phone Guy had introduced. They analyzed every newspaper clipping visible in the game. They examined the rules for safety poster. They studied Foxy's behavior patterns looking for signs of aggressive programming. They debated whether the out-of-order sign meant he was the culprit or just a red herring designed to mislead theorists. Little did anyone know at the time that the answer wouldn't come from examining FNAF 1 or even FNAF 2 more closely. The solution would require understanding something that happened 4 years earlier, in 1983, at a restaurant called Fredbear's Family Diner. The answer would come from witnessing a completely different bite incident, one that nobody even knew existed until FNAF 4 revealed it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to talk about FNAF 2 and how it seemingly brought us closer to the truth, while simultaneously leaving us with more questions than ever before. When FNAF 2 released in November 2014, just 3 months after the original game, the community was still reeling from the success and mystery of the first installment. Scott Cawthon had struck gold with FNAF 1, creating a phenomenon that transcended typical indie game success. The game had become a cultural touchstone, spawning countless Let's Play videos, memes, and theory discussions. So naturally, expectations were sky high for the sequel. Players were ready for more scares, more lore, and most importantly, more answers about the Bite of 87. The genius move that Scott pulled with FNAF 2 was making it a prequel, though this wasn't immediately obvious to players during their first playthrough. The restaurant looked different, more modern even, with bright colors and a cheerful atmosphere during Phone Guy's calls. The animatronics were new models, redesigned to be more kid-friendly with those wide eyes and permanent smiles that somehow managed to be even creepier than the originals. Everything seemed upgraded, more advanced, which naturally led many players to assume this was taking place after FNAF 1, showing a newer, more successful Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. But then you complete your week of nights, survive the increasing chaos and aggression of the animatronics, and you receive your paycheck. And there it is, printed in black and white on your paycheck stub, November 1987. This wasn't a sequel at all. This was the game that would finally show us what happened during that infamous year. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. We were here in 1987, the year of the bite. Surely, this game would give us the answers we'd been desperately seeking. The setup seemed absolutely perfect for finally solving the mystery. Here was a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location operating in exactly the right year, with a whole cast of potential culprits to analyze and theorize about. The toy animatronics, Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, and Toy Chica, were new suspects with their advanced mobility, facial recognition systems, and creepily friendly designs. But the old models were there too, withered and broken in the parts and service room, including the increasingly suspicious Foxy with his mangled appearance and aggressive behavior. And then there was Mangle, perhaps the most intriguing animatronic introduced in FNAF 2. Mangle's story within the game is tragic in its own way, adding a layer of melancholy to the horror. Originally designed as Toy Foxy for the Kids Cove area, the animatronic was meant to be a child-friendly version of the notorious Pirate Fox from the original restaurant, but children kept taking Mangle apart and putting them back together over and over, piece by piece, until the staff eventually gave up trying to maintain the animatronic's original form. They just started calling it the Mangle and left it as a take apart and put back together attraction. By the time Jeremy Fitzgerald starts his night shift, Mangle is a twisted mess of parts, wires and metal that crawls along the ceiling and walls, barely resembling a fox anymore. The transformation from Toy Foxy to Mangle represents something deeply unsettling about the FNAF universe. The casual acceptance of broken, dangerous things, the normalization of malfunction and decay. The way systems designed to entertain children can become nightmarish through neglect and misuse. The significance of Mangle to the Bite of 87 mystery cannot be overstated, and this would become clearer as the community analyzed the evidence. Here was an animatronic specifically stated to interact with children during the day, constantly handled and manipulated by guests. One that clearly had freedom of movement beyond just standing on a stage or in a fixed position. Mangle's jump scare animation became a subject of intense scrutiny. They descend from above, jaws wide open, targeting the player's head from an elevated position. The implications were hard to ignore for anyone seriously investigating the bite. If an animatronic was going to bite someone's frontal lobe during a daytime party, having the attack come from above, with the victim possibly being a child or someone kneeling down, would explain the precise positioning needed to cause the specific injury Phone Guy described. The trajectory of the bite, the angle of attack, the way Mangle's elongated snout could focus the force, it all fit together in a way that made Mangle the prime suspect for many theorists. Then there's Toy Chica, another suspect who would gain serious traction in later games, but was already suspicious in FNAF 2 if you knew what to look for. During certain camera angles showing the daytime party scenes, you could see Toy Chica without her beak. This detail seemed minor at first, just an odd quirk of the animatronics design, or perhaps a malfunction that needed repair. But in a series where Scott Cawthon carefully considers every detail, where nothing is truly random or meaningless, the missing beak felt significant. It felt like evidence of something. Was this proof of an incident? Had Toy Chica's beak been lodged in someone's skull during the bite of 87, requiring its removal? The theory gained credibility over time, especially when Scott himself would later comment on the significance of the missing beak, asking in a Reddit post why people thought the tiny Toy Chica would be missing her beak in reference to FNAF 4's minigames. That comment suggested the detail mattered, that it was a clue players should have been paying attention to all along. Phone Guy's calls in FNAF 2 added another layer of intrigue and mounting dread to the mystery. Over the course of the week, his messages become increasingly worried, increasingly frantic. By night 4, he mentions an investigation happening at the restaurant, the possibility of the location closing down for a few days. He warns Jeremy to avoid eye contact with the animatronics, suggesting that someone might have tampered with their facial recognition systems, making them more aggressive, more dangerous. The tension builds with each night, creating an overwhelming sense that something terrible is about to happen, that we're witnessing the build-up to the bite itself. And then comes night 6, and the message that changes everything, that seems to confirm what we've been suspecting all along. Phone Guy mentions that the restaurant is closing, that this is Jeremy's last shift as a night guard. But then he adds something crucial, something that would become one of the most analyzed pieces of dialogue in the entire franchise. He says that they want Jeremy to work one more shift, a day shift. We have one more event scheduled for tomorrow, a birthday. You'll be on day shift, wear your uniform, stay close to the animatronics, make sure they don't hurt anyone, okay? If you want to stay after your shift, Phone Guy adds, feel free to stick around for the grand reopening. But then he includes a telling detail. We may have to end up having to close for a few days. I don't know. I want to emphasize, though, that it's really just a precaution. The implication being that after tomorrow's party, after Jeremy's day shift working closely with the animatronics, during a birthday event with children present, something so catastrophic will happen that the restaurant never actually reopens as planned. The community immediately seized on this. Jeremy's day shift had to be when the bite occurred. The timeline made perfect sense. Jeremy works the night shift Sunday through Friday, getting increasingly desperate messages from Phone Guy about investigations and safety concerns. Then he's asked to work an additional day shift on Saturday for a birthday party, positioned close to the animatronics, who've been acting increasingly aggressive all week. And during that party, an animatronic bites someone's frontal lobe off, leading to the restaurant's immediate and permanent closure. To the policy changes Phone Guy mentioned in FNAF 1, the investigation Phone Guy mentioned, the tampering with the animatronics programming, Jeremy being asked to work during the day when the robots are most active and in close proximity to guests. It all pointed to Saturday, November 13th or 14th, 1987, as the date of the bite. The pieces seemed to fit together perfectly, finally giving the community a concrete timeline and set of circumstances for the incident. But here's where things get complicated, where the mystery deepens instead of resolving, where Scott demonstrates his commitment to indirect storytelling over easy answers. FNAF 2 never actually shows us the bite. The game ends after night 6, before Jeremy's fateful day shift. We never see what happens at that birthday party. We're left to infer everything from context, to piece together what must have occurred based on the information we've been given. The game gives us the when and the where and the why, but it doesn't show us the how or definitively confirm who was involved. And this is where the community really went to work, analyzing every detail, every possible clue with forensic intensity. The custom night paycheck for FNAF 2 shows a payment to Fritz Smith, not Jeremy Fitzgerald. dated November 14th, 1987. This implies that Jeremy's employment ended before the custom night, before November 14th, which aligns perfectly with the theory that something happened to him during that Saturday day shift. But what exactly? Did Jeremy himself get bitten? Or did he witness it happen to someone else, perhaps a child at the birthday party, and the trauma or liability led to his termination? The game doesn't confirm either way, leaving both possibilities open for interpretation. The leading theory that emerged from the community, the one that gained the most traction and seemed best supported by evidence, was that Mangle was responsible for the bite of 87. The case for Mangle seemed incredibly strong. They were stationed in Kids Cove, an area specifically designed for children to interact with them. Phone Guy explicitly mentions that kids kept taking Mangle apart and putting them back together, which proves constant direct interaction during operating hours, exactly the kind of proximity that could lead to an accidental or malfunction-based bite. Mangle's attack pattern in the game involves lunging from above, which would position their jaws at head height for a standing adult, or could easily catch a child's head if they were playing in Kids Cove. The jump scare animation shows Mangle going directly for the frontal lobe area, targeting the front of the player's face with precision. And perhaps most tellingly, Phone Guy's statement in FNAF 1 that the animatronics used to be allowed to walk around during the day implies that the bite was committed by an animatronic with mobility, not one fixed to a stage or confined to a back room. But the Toy Chica theory had its proponents too, and the evidence would only grow stronger as later games released. In Ultimate Custom Night, released years later in 2018, Toy Chica has voice lines that seem to reference the bite directly, that seem like Scott finally giving us confirmation of what happened. "Where's my beak?" she asks, with unsettling cheerfulness. "Lodged in your forehead, of course." The specificity of that line, the way it references both the missing beak we observed in FNAF 2 and the frontal lobe injury Phone Guy described, felt like a confession. Like Toy Chica admitting to the crime in her own twisted way. Scott Cawthon even commented on the mystery of why Toy Chica is missing her beak in the FNAF 4 minigames, explicitly acknowledging that this detail was more significant than a random design choice, that players should have been paying attention to it as a clue. If Toy Chica's beak ended up lodged in someone's skull during the bite, that would certainly explain its absence in subsequent appearances and would make her the prime suspect, possibly alongside or instead of Mangle. The toy animatronics being scrapped after FNAF 2 also fits the theory perfectly. Phone Guy in FNAF 3's training tapes mentions that the springlock suits were decommissioned after multiple and simultaneous springlock failures at a sister location, implying that Fazbear Entertainment's standard response to dangerous incidents is to remove the problematic technology entirely. If a toy animatronic caused the bite of 87, it makes complete sense that the entire toy line would be scrapped, with the company returning to the classic designs for any future locations. The toy animatronics were too advanced, too mobile, too capable of independent movement and decision-making. When combined with faulty programming or malicious tampering, which Phone Guy explicitly warns about, they became dangerous in ways the older, simpler animatronics weren't. Better to scrap the whole line and go back to the classics than risk another incident with advanced technology that clearly wasn't ready for public use. Some theories suggested that Withered Foxy might have been responsible, despite being kept in parts and service. His aggressive behavior, his severely damaged state, and the out-of-order sign in FNAF 1's Pirate Cove all seemed like evidence of past dangerous behavior. of an animatronic that had proven itself too dangerous for public interaction. But this theory had a major flaw that most serious theorists recognized. Phone Guy specifically mentions the animatronics being allowed to walk around during the day as the context for the bite, suggesting the incident happened in a public area during operating hours with guests present, not in a back room where the withered animatronics were stored away from customers. Withered Chica was another suspect, particularly after some promotional materials, and the help-wanted VR game seemed to show blood or organic material on her endoskeleton jaw. But again, this ran into the same fundamental problem as Foxy. She was stored away in parts and service, not interacting with guests during the day. For the bite to have the impact Phone Guy describes, policy changes, public outcry, damage to Fazbear Entertainment's reputation significant enough that it's still affecting operations 6 years later. It had to happen visibly, publicly, in front of multiple witnesses during regular business hours. The brilliance of FNAF 2's approach to the bite mystery is that it gave us so much context, so much circumstantial evidence and environmental storytelling, without actually answering the question directly. We learned when it happened. Late 1987, likely mid-November. We learned where it happened, at the FNAF 2 location during a day shift, probably at a birthday party. We learned the circumstances, children present, animatronics with freedom of movement, possible tampering with safety systems, an employee positioned close to the robots to monitor them. But we still didn't know definitively who did it or who the victim was. The game narrowed down the possibilities dramatically while still maintaining the mystery's core, still leaving room for debate and theory crafting and passionate discussion. And here's the crucial thing that FNAF 2 established, the detail that would become incredibly important for understanding what FNAF 4 was actually showing us. The bite of 87 was fundamentally tied to the restaurant's operating procedures, to animatronics being allowed to interact with customers during the day, to the business model of providing an interactive entertainment experience with robots that looked friendly but were actually incredibly dangerous. This context, this understanding of how the bite occurred within the normal operations of a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, would become essential for understanding the parallels with 1983 and how witnessing one bite incident could help us solve another. But in 2014 and early 2015, as players finished FNAF 2 and still lacked definitive answers, the community's emotions were mixed. Frustration mixed with fascination, satisfaction at learning so much mixed with disappointment that the ultimate question, which animatronic did it, remained unanswered. The investigation Phone Guy mentions, the tampering with facial recognition systems, the birthday party, Jeremy's day shift assignment, all of these elements created a perfect storm of circumstances that made the bite feel inevitable. We weren't just learning about a past incident anymore. We were watching it approach like a freight train in slow motion, seeing all the pieces fall into place that would lead to tragedy, knowing it was coming and being powerless to stop it. And perhaps that was Scott's intention all along, to make players feel that creeping dread, that knowledge that something terrible was about to happen, and there was nothing anyone in the game could do to prevent it. FNAF 2 transformed the bite of 87 from a mysterious historical event into something tangible and immediate, grounded in time and place, with suspects we could actually analyze and debate about with real evidence. The game took the vague reference from FNAF 1 and expanded it into a full narrative context. We understood the world of 1987 now, understood the corporate structure of Fazbear Entertainment, understood the way animatronics were used during this era, understood the kinds of birthday parties they hosted, and how children interacted with the robots. All of this context, all of this world building and environmental storytelling would prove absolutely essential for understanding what FNAF 4 was really telling us when it released the following year, even though that wouldn't become clear until much later, until the community had time to process and analyze and make connections. But in the immediate aftermath of FNAF 2, the community was left in a familiar position, closer to the truth than ever before, armed with more evidence and context, but still missing those crucial final pieces that would actually solve the mystery once and for all. Little did anyone know that the next game wouldn't move forward in the timeline, wouldn't show us what happened at the FNAF 1 location in 1993, or explore any events after the Bite of 87. Instead, FNAF 3 would jump 30 years into the future to 2023, introducing Springtrap and the horror attraction Fazbear's Fright, adding yet another layer to the franchise's complex timeline. And then FNAF 4 would arrive in the summer of 2015, and everything would change in ways nobody could have possibly predicted. The marketing campaign alone would become legendary, but not for the reasons anyone expected. If you were part of the FNAF community during the spring and summer of 2015, you remember the hype that built around FNAF 4, with an intensity that's hard to describe to someone who wasn't there. After the rapid-fire releases of FNAF 1, 2, and 3 in less than a year, Scott Cawthon had proven himself as a developer who could maintain a breakneck pace while still creating compelling horror experiences with genuine depth. But FNAF 4 felt different from the very beginning. This was being marketed as the final chapter, the game that would supposedly wrap up the main story, provide closure, answer the lingering questions that had kept the community theorizing for months. And Scott's teaser campaign for this final installment was perhaps his most elaborate yet, filled with hidden details and coded messages that drove the community into an absolute theory-crafting frenzy. The teasers began appearing on scottgames.com in early 2015, shadowy images of nightmare animatronics that looked like twisted, horrible versions of the characters we knew. These weren't just scarier designs. These were fundamentally different, grotesque interpretations of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy that looked like they'd crawled out of someone's worst nightmares. Nightmare Freddy appeared with rows of sharp, glistening teeth and a body covered in tiny Freddy heads that seemed to be eating him alive. Nightmare Bonnie had elongated limbs, massive teeth, and a grin that stretched impossibly wide across his face. Nightmare Chica looked somehow even more disturbing with her broken, mangled appearance that made even Mangle look tame by comparison. Each reveal was accompanied by cryptic text that seemed designed to drive theorists crazy. Was it me? The animatronics seemed to be asking, as if confessing to some terrible crime, as if one of them was the culprit everyone had been seeking. But here's the detail that really captured everyone's attention, that seemed to confirm what the community had been hoping for since the first game released. Players who examined the source code of Scott's website found the number 87 hidden there, repeated over and over in different teasers. In one particularly famous example, the Nightmare Foxy teaser had 87 hidden in his eye if you brightened the image enough, if you manipulated the contrast and really searched for it. The community went absolutely wild. This was it. This was finally it. FNAF 4 was going to show us the Bite of 87. After years of speculation, after endless debates about Mangle versus Toy Chica versus Foxy, after analyzing every frame of FNAF 1 and 2 looking for clues, we were finally going to see what actually happened on that infamous day in November 1987. The marketing seemed to be confirming it, seemed to be promising us the answer we'd been desperately seeking. The phrase, "was it me?" took on new, electrifying significance with this context. Each nightmare animatronic was asking if they were responsible for the bite, if they were the one who clamped down on someone's frontal lobe and changed Fazbear Entertainment's policies forever. Was it Nightmare Freddy? Was it Nightmare Bonnie? Was it Nightmare Chica? Was it Nightmare Foxy? Finally confirming the suspicions that had surrounded Foxy since the very first game. The marketing was positioning FNAF War as the game that would finally answer this burning question, that would finally reveal the truth after keeping us in suspense for so long. And why wouldn't it? Scott had been building toward this reveal since FNAF 1. The Bite of 87 was the franchise's greatest unsolved mystery, the question that kept people coming back, that kept the community active and engaged. Of course, the final chapter would address it directly. Of course, Scott would give us what we'd been asking for. It would be narratively unsatisfying to end the series without resolving this central mystery. That would leave fans frustrated and confused, would feel like a betrayal of the investment so many people had made in unraveling these mysteries. The community's enthusiasm reached absolute fever pitch as more teasers released throughout the spring and early summer. People were analyzing every pixel, every shadow, every hidden detail in the images. Theories flew about which animatronic would turn out to be the culprit, about what the nightmare versions represented, about whether we'd be playing as the bite victim or a witness. Some theorists suggested that the nightmare animatronics might be exaggerated, guilt-ridden memories from the perspective of the bite victim, that we'd be playing as someone who survived the attack and was now reliving it in fever dreams induced by trauma and medication. The final chapter tagline added enormous weight to every piece of promotional material, to every scrap of information Scott released. If this was truly the end of the story, then it had to resolve the franchise's biggest mystery. The Bite of 87 couldn't remain unsolved if the series was concluding. That would be a fundamental failure of storytelling, would leave a gaping hole in the narrative that fans would never stop talking about. So the assumption, the overwhelming consensus in the community, was that FNAF 4 would not only show us the bite, but would do so in spectacular, horrifying fashion as the climax of the entire saga. Then came the plush trap teaser in late June 2015, and everything changed. Everything we thought we knew, every theory we'd built, every expectation we'd formed based on months of marketing and speculation, suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Scott updated his website with an image of a small, creepy rabbit animatronic sitting in a chair at the end of a darkened hallway. The accompanying text warned players about something called Fun with Plush Trap, suggesting this would be a unique gameplay element, a new mechanic that would differentiate FNAF 4 from previous games. But when players examined the image more closely, when they looked at the fine details in that hallway and checked the source code as they'd learned to do with every Scott teaser, they noticed something that completely contradicted all their theories, all their expectations, everything the marketing had seemed to be building toward. The source code no longer said 87. It said 83, not 1987, but 1983. The community's reaction was immediate, explosive, and deeply divided. Some players insisted this had to be a typo, a mistake on Scott's part. There was no way he'd intentionally changed it. He'd been teasing 87 for months. This had to be an error, something that would be corrected once Scott noticed. Others argued it was another misdirection, another example of Scott trolling the community as he'd done before with fake teasers and red herrings. Surely the game was still about 1987. Surely we were still going to see the bite. The 83 had to mean something else. Maybe a date within the game's timeline. maybe a code to unlock something, maybe just Scott messing with us because he enjoyed watching the community freak out over every detail. After all, Scott Cawthon was known for his elaborate tricks and fake-outs, for playing with community expectations in ways that bordered on trolling. Maybe this was just another example of that, another test to see how we'd react, another way to keep us guessing right up until release. Surely he wouldn't actually change the game's focus this close to launch. That would be absurd. That would be cruel. But other players, the more cautious and analytical theorists, started to wonder. What if 83 wasn't a mistake? What if FNAF 4 wasn't actually about the bite of 87 at all? What if Scott had deliberately baited the entire community, using our expectations and desires against us in the most elaborate misdirection in the franchise's history? The very idea seemed almost unthinkably cruel. We'd been waiting for answers about 87 since the first game. Scott had seemed to promise those answers with all the 87 references in the early teasers, with the "Was it me" text, with everything about how the game was being marketed. Switching to 83 at the last minute would be the ultimate bait and switch, would be taking all that anticipation and excitement and just crushing it. It would feel like Scott was deliberately withholding information, extending the mystery indefinitely, rather than providing the resolution a final chapter should deliver. The debate intensified as more details emerged in the final weeks before release. Some pointed out that the teasers had never explicitly stated the game would show the bite of 87. The 87s were hidden in source code and manipulated images, found by players digging deeper than the surface level. The "Was it me?" text could be interpreted in multiple ways, could refer to multiple different incidents or themes. Maybe Scott had never actually promised what everyone assumed he'd promised. Maybe the community had convinced itself that FNAF 4 would show the bite of 87 based on ambiguous clues and wishful thinking, rather than any clear statement from Scott himself. When the game finally released on July 23, 2015, earlier than expected, dropping suddenly without much warning, players dove in immediately, desperate to see which interpretation was correct, desperate to finally get answers one way or another. The gameplay was intense and terrifying in new ways, with nightmare animatronics stalking you through a child's bedroom, breathing at doors, lurking in closets, hiding under the bed, waiting in the darkness for you to make a mistake. The mechanics were different from previous games, requiring you to listen carefully for breathing sounds, to shine your flashlight at precisely the right moments, to check multiple angles constantly. But it was the mini-games between nights that held the answers everyone sought, that would finally clarify what this game was really about and what year it took place in. These mini-games showed a young child, small and vulnerable, clearly terrified of the animatronics at Fredbear's family diner. He's being tormented by older kids wearing masks of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. Bullies who know about his fear and exploit it mercilessly. They jump out at him, chase him, make scary noises, traumatize this poor kid who just wants to be left alone. The child has nightmares about the animatronics, horrible visions of them coming to life and hunting him. And the terror is so visceral, so affecting, that players immediately felt sympathy for this crying child. And then, in the house where the child lives, players found it. A television screen showing a cartoon program called Fredbear and Friends, some kind of show that must have helped popularize the restaurant chain. And right there on the screen, impossible to miss, impossible to misinterpret, was a copyright date displayed clearly in pixelated letters. 1983. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a typo. It wasn't a red herring or a code or a fake out. The game was set in 1983, 4 years before the bite of 87. The community had been completely, deliberately misdirected. The feeling of betrayal among some fans was palpable, visceral, raw. Players had waited over a year for answers about the bite of 87, had theorized and debated and analyzed for countless hours. Scott had seemed to promise those answers with his marketing campaign, with the 87s in the source code, with the final chapter branding that suggested resolution and closure. And instead, we got a different bite, an earlier incident that nobody had even known existed until that moment. What was the point? Why show us a bite from 1983 when 1987 was the one everyone cared about, the one that had been driving theories and discussions since the franchise began? It felt like Scott was deliberately withholding the information we wanted, playing games with the community's expectations, extending the mystery indefinitely instead of providing the answers a final chapter should deliver. Some fans were genuinely angry, feeling like they'd been tricked, like Scott had pulled the rug out from under them after building up their expectations for months. But this reaction, understandable as it was in the moment, missed the bigger picture entirely. It missed what Scott was actually doing, the sophisticated narrative technique he was employing. The misdirection wasn't cruel trolling or arbitrary mystery mongering for its own sake. It was actually brilliant storytelling, setting up a revelation that would fundamentally change how we understood the entire franchise, how we approached its mysteries, how we thought about corporate negligence and institutional failure, and the patterns that define Fazbear Entertainment's history. By showing us the bite of 83 first, by depicting in graphic detail what happens when an animatronic's jaws close on a child's head at a family restaurant, Scott was giving us the template we needed to understand what happened in 87. He was providing context we didn't even realize we needed, answering questions we didn't know to ask. The bite of 83 wasn't a distraction from solving the bite of 87. It was the key to solving it, the essential piece of information that would finally allow everything else to make sense. The marketing campaign for FNAF 4 worked exactly as Scott intended, even if players didn't appreciate it at the time, even if it took months for the community to fully understand what he'd done. Scott got everyone focused on the bite of 87, made us expect to see it, built up that anticipation until we were absolutely convinced we knew what the game would show us. And then he revealed something we didn't expect, something that initially seemed like a disappointing twist, like a denial of what we wanted. But it was actually the key to solving the mystery we'd been chasing since FNAF 1. The essential context that would finally make everything clear. Looking back now, years later with the benefit of hindsight, and additional games that have confirmed Scott's intentions, the genius of the 87 to 83 bait and switch becomes crystal clear. Scott couldn't just show us the bite of 87 directly, because that would be too straightforward, too simple for the kind of storytelling FNAF had established. It would be giving away the answer rather than letting players solve the mystery themselves. But he could show us a parallel incident, one that established crucial facts about how these bites occur, what their medical consequences are, what the positioning and mechanics look like, and how Fazbear Entertainment responds to such tragedies. By showing us 83 in complete detail, he gave us everything we needed to figure out 87 ourselves, to understand it without needing to see it directly. The "Was it me?" tagline also takes on profound new meaning with this context. The nightmare animatronics weren't asking if they committed the bite of 87. They were asking if they were responsible for tormenting this child, for contributing to the fear and trauma that would lead to the tragedy we witness in the mini-games. The question wasn't about identifying a culprit for a specific incident. It was about understanding the circumstances that lead to bite incidents in general, about recognizing the patterns of negligence and danger that make these tragedies inevitable. Scott's marketing strategy showed a deep, sophisticated understanding of his audience. He knew what we wanted to see, what mystery we were most desperate to solve, and he used that knowledge to create an experience that was simultaneously frustrating and fascinating. The initial disappointment many players felt about 83 instead of 87 was intentional, was part of the narrative journey Scott was crafting. He wanted players to feel confused, to have their expectations subverted dramatically, because that confusion would eventually transform into understanding, into appreciation for the more nuanced approach he'd taken. The community's reaction to the 83 reveal is worth examining, because it reveals something important about how mystery stories work and how audiences engage with them. We'd become so fixated on the bite of 87, so invested in solving that particular puzzle, that we couldn't immediately see the value in learning about a different incident. We couldn't understand how information about 1983 could possibly help us understand 1987. It took time for the community to step back, to process, to realize that maybe Scott hadn't failed to deliver what he promised. Maybe he delivered something even more valuable, the context and framework to solve the mystery ourselves, rather than having the answer handed to us. And that's what makes the FNAF 4 marketing campaign so fascinating to analyze years later. It wasn't just promotion for a game. It was part of the game itself, part of the story Scott was telling about mystery and revelation, about expectations and surprises, about how sometimes the answer you seek isn't found where you expect to find it, but rather in understanding the patterns and parallels that connect different events. The 87s in the source code and teasers weren't lies or tricks. They were Scott acknowledging what the community wanted, what question was burning in everyone's mind. But then the 83 was him saying, "To understand what you want to know, you first need to learn about this." The misdirection worked perfectly because it forced players to reconsider their assumptions about FNAF's narrative structure, about how Scott approaches storytelling, about what a final chapter actually means in a franchise built on indirect revelation and hidden lore. Up until FNAF 4, the games had been moving forward chronologically in terms of their releases, even if the internal timeline was scrambled. FNAF 1 was set in the 90s, FNAF 2 in the late 80s, FNAF 3 in 2023. There was a sense of progression, of the story building towards something, moving forward through time. FNAF 4, going all the way back to 1983, to the very beginning of Fazbear Entertainment's history, broke that pattern dramatically. It suggested that the answers we needed might lie in the past, not the future. That understanding the origins of these tragedies was essential for understanding their repetition. That Scott's storytelling was more sophisticated than a simple linear progression from question to answer. So while the immediate reaction to FNAF 4's marketing campaign and the 83 reveal was deeply mixed, ranging from confusion to disappointment to genuine anger among some fans, the long-term impact was profound and positive. It changed how the community approached FNAF mysteries going forward, teaching us to look for indirect answers, to value parallel narratives, to understand that Scott's approach to storytelling was more complex than simple question and answer structure. It showed us that his narrative craft was more sophisticated than we'd given him credit for, that he was playing a longer game than we realized. And most importantly, even if we didn't realize it at the time, even if it took months for the implications to sink in, the marketing campaign and the game itself gave us exactly what we needed to finally understand the bite of 87. The secret solution was hidden in plain sight, just not in the game that showed us 1987, but in the game that showed us 1983. That's the brilliance of it. That's why it works so perfectly, even though it initially felt like a betrayal. Scott trusted that we would eventually figure it out, that we would make the connections he was laying out for us, and we did. The community did solve it, did come to understand what FNAF 4 was really telling us. It just took time, patience, and a willingness to let go of our preconceptions about what answers should look like. The moment players saw that television screen in FNAF 4's minigames displaying Fredbear and Friends 1983 in pixelated letters, the community erupted into a debate that would last for months and fundamentally reshape how we understood the franchise's timeline and central mysteries. This wasn't just a date on a screen. This was a complete upheaval of everything we thought we knew, and the implications went far beyond simply establishing when the game took place. This single piece of information forced a fundamental reassessment of the Bite of 87 mystery and opened up questions that nobody had even thought to ask before. Let's talk about what that television screen actually shows us and why it matters so much. In the child's bedroom during the minigame segments between nights, you can interact with various objects. The TV is one of them, and when you do, it displays what appears to be a commercial or title screen for a cartoon show featuring Fredbear and his friends. The copyright date is right there, clearly visible, impossible to miss. 1983. This isn't hidden in source code like the earlier 87s and 83s from the teasers were. This isn't something you have to manipulate images or dig through website metadata to find. This is in-game canonical information that players would naturally discover during normal progression through the minigames. The significance extends beyond just the date itself. The fact that it's a television show, not just a restaurant logo or promotional poster, tells us something important about how these characters existed in the FNAF universe, about how Fazbear Entertainment built its brand. There was apparently a Fredbear and Friends cartoon that aired in 1983, which would have contributed significantly to the popularity of the actual Fredbear's Family Diner restaurant chain. This was multimedia franchise development before that concept was even common in the 1980s, showing that whoever created Fredbear, we'd later learn this was likely William Afton and Henry Emily, understood how to build a brand with reach beyond just physical restaurant locations. The characters weren't just mascots. They were entertainment properties that could exist in multiple forms, that could reach children through television and build excitement for visiting the restaurants. But the date itself, 1983, that's what sent genuine shockwaves through the community and started arguments that would rage for months. If the game's minigames were taking place in 1983, 4 full years before the Bite of 87, then what we were about to witness at the end of Night 5, when the crying child is lifted up and his head is forced into Fredbear's mouth, couldn't possibly be that incident. It would be something else entirely, something that the franchise had never even hinted at before this moment. The entire foundation of what players expected from FNAF 4 crumbled in that instant. Some players absolutely refused to accept this at face value. They constructed elaborate theories arguing that the TV could be showing a rerun, that just because the show was copyrighted in 1983 didn't necessarily mean the current year was 1983. Old shows get rebroadcast all the time, they argued, especially children's programming. Maybe the crying child was just watching reruns of a show from 4 years ago, and the actual events of the game still took place in 1987, as everyone expected. This theory had some merit on the surface. After all, Scott could have easily put current year 1983 on the screen if he wanted to make the date absolutely unambiguously clear. Others suggested a more complex timeline, proposing that maybe different parts of FNAF 4 took place in different years. The minigames might be flashbacks to 1983, showing the crying child's early trauma, while the nightmare sections happened later, possibly during or after 1987, perhaps during the bite victim's recovery. This would explain both the 83 and the 87 references, would reconcile the conflicting information from the teasers and the actual game. The nightmare animatronics could be fever dreams during recovery from the bite of 87, informed by traumatic memories from 1983 events. But the more players progressed through the minigames, the more they explored every detail of the game's story, the clearer it became that the entire narrative was set in 1983, that this wasn't ambiguous or open to multiple interpretations. The location shown in the minigames is Fredbear's family diner, explicitly identified as such, not Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The only animatronics present are Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, the original springlock suit characters. There are no toy animatronics, no Mangle, none of the suspects from FNAF 2 who might have committed the bite of 87. Everything about the setting, the technology, the branding, suggested an earlier era in the franchise's timeline, the very beginning of Fazbear Entertainment's existence, before Freddy Fazbear's Pizza even existed as a concept. Sister Location, which released the following year in October 2016, would essentially confirm this date beyond any possible doubt. That game required players to enter 1983 as a keypad code to access private security camera footage of the FNAF 4 bedroom, showing the crying child sleeping while being watched. This was Scott doubling down on the date, making it absolutely clear through a completely different game that yes, the minigames definitely took place in 1983. And no, this wasn't ambiguous or open to alternative interpretations. The crying child story happened 4 years before the bite of 87, period. Once the community largely accepted that FNAF 4 was set in 1983, and this acceptance came gradually, grudgingly, with plenty of holdouts who refused to let go of their theories, a new question emerged that was arguably even more important. What exactly was this game showing us? The minigames culminate in the child being grabbed by his bullying brother and his brother's friends, all wearing animatronic masks. They carry him toward the stage despite his screaming and struggling, despite his obvious terror. They lift him up to Fredbear's mouth, shoving his head inside the animatronic's jaws for what they call a big kiss from Fredbear. And then Fredbear's jaws clamp down with horrific force. We see blood. We see the other children's immediate horror as they realize what they've done, how their cruel prank went catastrophically wrong. We see the aftermath in a hospital room where the child is surrounded by flowers, IV drips, pills, medical equipment, desperately trying to keep him alive. The minigames across multiple nights suggest that we're visiting his bedside over several days as his condition deteriorates. And in the final moments, we hear what sounds unmistakably like a heart monitor flatlining, the long, continuous tone that signals death, suggesting that unlike the bite of 87 victim, this child did not survive his injuries. This was clearly a bite incident, clearly parallel to what Phone Guy described about the bite of 87. Someone's head in an animatronic's mouth, severe trauma to the brain, life-altering or life-ending injury. But if this happened in 1983, if this was a completely different incident from the bite of 87, then what was it called? The community needed terminology to discuss it, needed a way to differentiate between these two separate tragedies. The term bite of 83 emerged organically from community discussions and quickly became standard. Later materials from Scott, including references in subsequent games, would actually use the term the Big Bite for this incident, suggesting that within the franchise's lore, this event had its own name that differentiated it from the later 1987 incident. The existence of two separate bite incidents, once players fully accepted and understood it, completely recontextualized Phone Guy's statements from FNAF 1 in crucial ways. When he said, "Then there was the bite of 87, he wasn't describing the first or only time an animatronic had bitten someone. He was describing the incident that specifically led to the policy changes at Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations. The one that occurred in 1987 at a Freddy's restaurant, as opposed to the earlier incident in 1983 at Fredbear's Diner. The bite of 87 was significant not because it was the only such incident, but because it was the one that finally, belatedly forced Fazbear Entertainment to restrict animatronic movement during business hours, to acknowledge publicly that their entertainment model was fundamentally dangerous. This revelation raised deeply uncomfortable questions about the company's safety practices and priorities. If a similar bite incident had occurred 4 years earlier at Fredbear's, why were animatronics still allowed to roam freely and interact with customers in 1987? Why hadn't the lessons from the bite of 83 led to immediate comprehensive policy changes across all locations? Why was the same dangerous model of operation still being used after a child had died from an animatronic bite? The answer, grim as it is, seems to be that Fazbear Entertainment prioritized profit over safety at every turn, that they were willing to risk another tragedy if it meant maintaining the interactive experience that made their restaurants popular and profitable. The bite at Fredbear's didn't change anything because the company didn't want to change, didn't want to sacrifice the business model that made them successful. Only when it happened again, when the pattern became undeniable and public pressure forced their hand, did they implement even minimal restrictions. The bite of 83 also helped explain some of the confusion and contradictions that had surrounded the franchise's timeline since the beginning. Events that didn't quite fit with the idea that the bite of 87 was the first such incident now made more sense. References to past tragedies, to locations closing, to springlock suits being decommissioned. All of this started to fit together once we understood there were multiple serious incidents across Fazbear Entertainment's history, not just one defining tragedy. The exact mechanics of what happened to the crying child remain somewhat debated in the community even now. Was it simply that Fredbear's jaws closed during normal animatronic operation while the child's head was inside? Or did moisture from the child's tears trigger a springlock failure, causing the mechanisms to violently compress? The game doesn't explicitly clarify, leaving room for interpretation. But what's clear is that the incident demonstrated that springlock-era animatronics carried serious, potentially lethal risks when humans got too close to their mechanical jaws, especially when those jaws were capable of crushing force. This context helps explain why Phone Guy in FNAF 3's training tapes mentions that springlock suits were eventually decommissioned after safety concerns, after multiple and simultaneous springlock failures at an unspecified sister location. Even if the specific incidents he references might have been separate from the bite of 83, the overall picture is clear. These early animatronic designs were dangerous, and the company knew it. And it took multiple tragedies before they were finally removed from service. The community's journey from rejecting the 1983 date to accepting it, to eventually understanding its profound significance, is absolutely fascinating to track through old forum posts, YouTube videos, Reddit discussions, and comment sections from 2015 and 2016. There's a clear progression you can observe, from "this can't be right" Scott made a mistake, to okay, it's 1983, but what does that mean? To finally, oh, this actually helps us understand what happened in 1987. It took months for people to make that final connection, to realize that Scott wasn't withholding information about the bite of 87. By showing us 83, he was providing essential context, giving us the framework we needed to solve the mystery ourselves. What makes the 1983 revelation so effective from a pure storytelling perspective is that it introduced a crucial concept that transformed how we understood the entire franchise: pattern. These bite incidents weren't one-time flukes, weren't isolated accidents that could be explained away. They were recurring problems stemming directly from how Fazbear Entertainment chose to operate their restaurants. The bite of 83 established that animatronic jaws can and will cause severe head trauma under certain circumstances. The bite of 87 proved that the company hadn't learned from its past, that it was willing to repeat the same mistakes with predictably tragic consequences. Understanding one bite incident would necessarily help us understand the other, because they were manifestations of the same fundamental problems. Powerful mechanical jaws in close proximity to vulnerable humans, inadequate supervision, entertainment value prioritized over safety, corporate negligence that treated tragedies as PR problems rather than moral failures. Some players initially felt like Scott was dodging the question by showing us 1983 instead of 1987, like he was deliberately refusing to give straight answers. But over time, as analysis deepened and connections were made, it became clear that this was actually a more sophisticated approach to answering the question than just showing us the bite of 87 directly would have been. If FNAF 4 had simply depicted the 1987 incident, that would be it. Mystery solved, case closed. Nothing left to theorize about, no reason to keep discussing and analyzing. But by showing us 83 while providing the tools to understand 87, Scott kept the mystery alive while still rewarding long-term fans with crucial information. He respected the intelligence of his audience, trusted that players could extrapolate from what they were shown to understand what they weren't explicitly shown. This is sophisticated narrative craft that you don't see often in video games. The Crying Child story in 1983 also added emotional weight and human cost to the franchise that had been largely abstract before. Yes, we knew terrible things happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Yes, we knew children had been murdered, that people had been hurt. But those were distant events, things we learned about through newspaper clippings and vague phone calls. The bite of 83, though, we witnessed that. We played as this terrified child, experienced his nightmares firsthand, watched him get bullied and tormented, saw the moment when fear became tragedy. We watched him die. It made the horror of these incidents feel visceral and real in a way they hadn't before. And perhaps that emotional reality, that gut-level understanding of what a bite incident actually looks like from the victim's perspective, was crucial for properly processing what happened in 1987. We couldn't just academically theorize about which animatronic did it anymore. We'd seen the fear, the screaming, the blood, the hospital room, the flatline. We understood the human cost in a way that would color every theory and discussion going forward. The 1983 revelation also opened up a whole new area of lore to explore, new questions that would drive theories for years. What happened to Fredbear's family diner after the bite of 83? Who was the crying child? Who was his family? The game heavily implied through various details that his father was William Afton, the purple guy we'd seen in previous games, the serial killer who would go on to murder multiple children. His brother was likely Michael Afton, who would become the protagonist of multiple later games. Suddenly, we had a family drama underlying the horror, relationships, and trauma and guilt that motivated the terrible events to come. So while the initial reaction to 1983 appearing on that TV screen was confusion, disappointment, and frustration for many players, it ultimately proved to be one of the most important revelations in the entire franchise. It transformed the Bite of 87 from an isolated mystery into part of a larger pattern of negligence and tragedy. It gave us context for understanding how these incidents occur, what their aftermath looks like, and how Fazbear Entertainment responds to them. It showed us the human cost in visceral detail that made the horror feel real rather than abstract. And most crucially, it showed us that to solve the mystery of 87, we needed to understand 83 first. The television screen in that child's bedroom wasn't just showing us a date. It was showing us the key to unlocking years of speculation and mystery. We just had to be patient enough, thoughtful enough, to understand what Scott was telling us and why he chose to tell it this way. The answer was there. We just needed to learn how to see it. Now that we understand there were two distinct Bite incidents separated by 4 years, we can start to see how FNAF 4 actually gave us everything we needed to solve the Bite of 87 mystery. By showing us the Bite of 83 in complete, unflinching detail, Scott Cawthon provided a template, a framework, a comprehensive example of what these incidents look like from start to finish. Every question we had about the Bite of 87 could be answered by thinking carefully about what we learned from witnessing the Bite of 83. Let's break down exactly how watching the tragedy at Fredbear's family diner helped us finally understand what happened at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza 4 years later. First, and most fundamentally, FNAF 4 established beyond any doubt that animatronic Bite incidents at birthday parties are possible and have actually occurred. Before this game, we only had Phone Guy's vague reference to work with. Some players wondered if the Bite of 87 was exaggerated or mythologized, if maybe it wasn't as severe as Phone Guy made it sound, if perhaps it was some kind of misunderstood accident that got blown out of proportion in the retelling. But seeing the Bite of 83 happen on screen, watching Fredbear's jaws close on the crying child's head with brutal force, witnessing the blood and the immediate horror and the desperate aftermath, confirmed that these incidents are exactly as terrible as Phone Guy implied. The medical reality he described becomes visceral and undeniable after FNAF 4. When he says, "It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe," we now have context for what that means. We've seen what happens when an animatronic bites someone's head. The crushing pressure, the immediate catastrophic damage, the life-threatening nature of the injury. And paradoxically, this makes Phone Guy's amazement about survival more understandable and more disturbing. The crying child appears to die from his injuries based on that heart monitor flatline in the final minigame. So for someone to survive a similar incident, as the Bite of 87 victim apparently did, truly would be medically remarkable, would be beating odds that should have been impossible. FNAF 4 also established the daytime party context that was crucial for understanding how the Bite of 87 occurred. Throughout the minigames, we see birthday celebrations happening during normal operating hours at Fredbear's family diner. Children are running around everywhere. Balloons and decorations fill the space. The animatronics are active, performing, moving around. This is the environment where Bite incidents occur, not during late-night security shifts, not in back rooms or after hours, but during regular business operations when the restaurant is full of families and children, when chaos and excitement make close supervision difficult. This context directly supports the theory that Jeremy Fitzgerald's day shift assignment for a birthday party in FNAF 2 is when the Bite of 87 happened. The parallel is clear. Both incidents occurred during the day, at parties, with children present, and animatronics active. The game also demonstrates the specific vulnerability of children and the precise mechanics of how animatronic jaws can cause frontal lobe damage. The crying child's positioning when his head is forced into Fredbear's mouth shows us the angle and location of impact. Because he's a small child being lifted up to the animatronic's face level, the bite naturally impacts the front of his skull, right where the frontal lobe is located behind the forehead. This explains the precision of the injury phone guy described. It's not random chance that the frontal lobe specifically was damaged in the bite of 87. That's the natural result of how bite incidents occur when a victim's face is positioned at animatronic mouth level. Whether it's a child being lifted up or an adult bending down to interact with a smaller animatronic, the geometry creates a situation where the front of the skull is most vulnerable to bite impact. Another crucial element that FNAF 4 establishes is the role of witnesses and partygoers in these incidents. When the bite of 83 occurs, it happens in front of a crowd. Other children see it. Adults are nearby, though clearly not supervising closely enough. It's a public tragedy unfolding in a space where it should have been impossible for something so horrible to happen. This explains why the bite of 87 had such a devastating impact on Fazbear Entertainment's reputation and operations. It wasn't a quiet incident that could be covered up or minimized. It happened during the day at a birthday party, with multiple witnesses who would tell their friends and family, who would talk to the press, who would ensure the story spread far beyond the immediate incident. FNAF 4 also clarified the mechanics of how these incidents happen, which was vitally important for narrowing down suspects in the bite of 87. We see that the crying child's head is forcibly placed in Fredbear's mouth by the bullies, and the animatronic's jaws then close, either through normal performance programming or possibly through a springlock failure triggered by the disturbance and moisture. This established that animatronic bites don't necessarily require the robot to be actively hunting or attacking someone with malicious intent. They can happen when someone is too close to the jaws during normal operation, or when the animatronic's programming causes them to close their mouth at an inopportune moment, or when a mechanical failure occurs at exactly the wrong time. This understanding was absolutely crucial for evaluating the suspects in the bite of 87. It meant we weren't just looking for which animatronic could actively attack someone. We were looking for which animatronic would have been close enough to guest during a daytime party, which one could have had their jaws near someone's head through normal interaction or performance, which one could have closed their mouth at exactly the wrong moment with devastating results. This naturally elevated Mangle as a prime suspect. Mangle was positioned in Kids Cove with documented constant interaction with children. Mangle's mobility allowed them to get extremely close to guests, unlike stage-bound performers. And Mangle's jump scare animation shows an attack from above that would position their jaws at head height for a standing adult, or perfectly at a child's head level. The mechanics we learned from the bite of 83 fit perfectly with how a Mangle-caused bite would occur. The game also established important information about company response to these incidents, showing us Fazbear Entertainment's pattern of behavior. After the bite of 83, springlock suits were eventually decommissioned. After the bite of 87, animatronics were restricted from day roaming. Both incidents led to operational changes, temporary closures, and significant damage to the company's reputation. But critically, both times Fazbear Entertainment tried to continue operating rather than shutting down permanently or fundamentally rethinking their business model. This tells us everything about the company's priorities and how they handle tragedy. They implement specific fixes to address the immediate problem that caused public outrage, but they try to maintain their core business model as much as possible, even if that means ongoing risk to guests and employees. It's damage control, not actual reform. FNAF 4's depiction of the hospital room aftermath also provided essential context for what the Bite of 87 victim might have experienced. We see flowers, presumably from the Freddy's location, trying to appear sympathetic while managing their liability. We see pills and IV bags, advanced medical equipment keeping the patient alive against terrible odds. We see the slow deterioration suggested by the minigames taking place across multiple nights, as if we're visiting the crying child's bedside over several agonizing days while his condition worsens. If the Bite of 87 victim survived, as Phone Guy's comment implies they did, they would have gone through similar treatment, similar medical intervention, similar uncertainty about whether they would pull through and what kind of life they'd have if they did survive. The emotional weight of FNAF 4's depiction helped explain why the Bite of 87 was such a defining moment for the franchise's timeline and for the community's engagement with the lore. Before seeing the Bite of 83, we talked about the Bite of 87 primarily in terms of mystery solving. Which animatronic? Who was the victim? When exactly did it happen? But after FNAF 4, we understood the human cost, the sheer terror the victim must have felt, the trauma for witnesses, the grief for family and friends, regardless of whether the victim died or survived with severe brain damage. The incident became real in a way it hadn't been before, which made solving the mystery feel more important, more meaningful, more respectful of the tragedy involved. FNAF 4 also established that bite incidents can occur even when animatronics aren't specifically malfunctioning or possessed by vengeful spirits. Fredbear wasn't trying to hurt the crying child. The animatronic was just performing its normal function, moving and operating as designed when children forcibly placed the victim in a dangerous position. This meant that for the Bite of 87, we didn't necessarily need to explain the attack as being caused by possession or deliberate tampering, though those factors might have contributed or made it more likely. An animatronic could cause catastrophic injury through normal operation if safety protocols weren't adequate, if supervision wasn't sufficient, if the wrong combination of circumstances occurred. The game's treatment of springlock technology is particularly important for understanding the Bite of 87, even though the 1987 incident almost certainly didn't involve a springlock suit directly. Seeing how springlock mechanisms work, how they can fail catastrophically, how they can cause crushing injuries when they release, provided useful context for thinking about animatronic jaw mechanics in general. The basic principle, powerful mechanical systems with tremendous crushing force that can activate rapidly, applies to all animatronics, not just springlock suits. Understanding one type of mechanism helps understand the dangers inherent in all of them. FNAF 4 also solved a meta-puzzle about the Bite of 87 mystery, explaining why Scott had been so reluctant to show it directly for so long. It wasn't just mystery for mystery's sake, wasn't just withholding information to frustrate fans. It was because showing one incident in complete detail, the Bite of 83, while leaving the other to inference and deduction, the Bite of 87, created a more engaging, thought-provoking narrative than simply depicting both incidents explicitly. Players had to think critically about parallels and differences, had to apply what they learned about one incident to understand the other, had to engage actively with the story rather than passively receiving information. The game demonstrated that animatronic bite incidents are fundamentally about failures of supervision and safety protocols, not just about which specific robot did it. At Fredbear's, The adults weren't paying enough attention to prevent bullying from escalating dangerously. The stage wasn't secured to prevent children from accessing the animatronics jaws. There was no staff member positioned to intervene before tragedy occurred. These same types of failures must have been present at the FNAF 2 location for the bite of 87 to happen. It wasn't just about which animatronics jaws closed, but about how the entire environment and safety structure failed simultaneously. FNAF 4's treatment of the crying child's perspective also provided disturbing insight into what the bite of 87 victim might have experienced in those final moments before the bite. The overwhelming fear, the sense of helplessness, the screaming and panic, the confusion and pain after the jaws close. All of these are things the 87 victim would have felt too. If Jeremy Fitzgerald was indeed that victim, imagine him during that day shift. Perhaps interacting with children at the party, perhaps having an animatronic get too close, perhaps a moment of distraction or malfunction, and then the absolute nightmare of teeth closing on his head, crushing through skull, destroying brain tissue. The game also established that Fazbear Entertainment's attempts to distance themselves from tragedy are hollow corporate gestures. They'll send flowers to the hospital. They'll make public statements about safety being their top priority. They'll implement new restrictions that sound good in press releases, but fundamentally, they'll keep operating restaurants with dangerous animatronics, keep putting people in unsafe situations, keep prioritizing entertainment value and profit over actual human safety. Understanding this about the company after seeing their response to 83 helps us understand their response to 87. The patterns of institutional failure become crystal clear. Perhaps most importantly, FNAF 4 gave the community permission to approach the Bite of 87 mystery differently. Instead of needing to find definitive proof of every single detail, instead of requiring Scott to explicitly show everything in a cutscene or minigame, we could extrapolate from what we knew about bite incidents in general. We could look at the evidence from FNAF 2 about timing, location, and suspects, and we could apply our understanding from FNAF 4 about mechanics, medical consequences, and context. The mystery became solvable through inference and deduction, rather than through explicit revelation. This is the fundamental way that FNAF 4 solved the Bite of 87. By giving us a complete template, a comprehensive framework, a detailed example of what these incidents look like from start to finish. Every question we had about 87 could be answered by thinking about what we learned from 83. What does it look like when it happens? Like what we saw at Fredbear's. What are the medical consequences? We saw that in the hospital room. Why didn't the company prevent it? Because they didn't learn from the previous incident. How could an animatronic bite someone during a party? The same way Fredbear did, through proximity, timing, and either programming or mechanical failure. The beauty of this approach is that it solved the mystery while still allowing room for ongoing discussion and theory crafting. We can debate whether it was Mangle or Toy Chica, or potentially another suspect. We can theorize about whether Jeremy was the victim or witnessed it happen to someone else. We can discuss the exact timeline of events during that fateful day shift. But we're doing so with a solid foundation of understanding about what bite incidents entail. Thanks to FNAF 4, showing us one in complete, unflinching detail. Scott Cawthon's decision to show us 1983 instead of 1987 proved to be narratively brilliant. It gave us more than just an answer to a mystery. It gave us context, emotional weight, thematic depth about institutional failure and repeated tragedy, and a framework for understanding how these horrible events work in the FNAF universe. And it respected the intelligence of his audience, trusting that players would make the connections, would apply what they learned, would figure out the solution, even though it wasn't handed to them on a silver platter. That's how FNAF 4 secretly solved the bite of 87. Not by showing us that incident directly, but by showing us everything we needed to understand it. Not by giving us the answer, but by giving us the tools to find the answer ourselves. It's sophisticated storytelling that treats the audience as intelligent, engaged participants in solving the mystery, rather than passive consumers waiting to be told what happened. And that's what makes it brilliant. Armed with everything FNAF 4 taught us about how bite incidents occur, about the mechanics and context and medical realities, we can now approach the question of which animatronic caused the bite of 87 with much greater clarity and confidence. The game didn't just give us general context about bite incidents, it also helped eliminate certain suspects and strengthen the cases for others through the specific details it established about when, where, and how these tragedies unfold. Let's examine the major suspects and evaluate them based on what we learned from witnessing the bite of 83 in detail. Mangle remains the strongest, most compelling candidate, and FNAF 4 actually strengthened this theory in several significant ways. First, by establishing that bite incidents occurred during daytime parties with children present and animatronics actively performing and interacting with guests. The game confirmed we should focus our investigation on animatronics that had direct access to guests during operating hours. Mangle was specifically stationed in Kids Cove, an area explicitly designed for children to interact with the animatronic directly. Phone Guy in FNAF 2 mentions that Mangle was essentially left as a take apart and put back together attraction after kids kept disassembling them repeatedly. This means Mangle had constant, unsupervised direct contact with children, exactly the kind of dangerous proximity that could lead to a bite incident. The positioning demonstrated in FNAF 4 is absolutely crucial here. The crying child's head is at mouth level with Fredbear because he's being lifted up by the bullies. For the bite of 87 to cause specific frontal lobe damage without killing the victim instantly, the positioning would need to be similar, a horizontal bite across the forehead and front of the skull. Mangle's attack pattern and behavior fit this perfectly. Mangle's jump scare animation involves descending from above, coming from the ceiling where they spend most of their time, jaws wide open, targeting the player's head from an elevated angle. This would position Mangle's jaws at exactly the right height for an adult who's standing or kneeling, or for a child's head if they're playing in Kids Cove. The geometry works perfectly for causing the specific type of injury Phone Guy described. The medical precision of the frontal lobe injury becomes more understandable when we consider Mangle's specific design compared to other animatronics. Unlike the chunky, rounded heads of the main stage performers, Mangle's elongated snout and angular jaw structure could potentially deliver a more focused bite. The force would be concentrated on a smaller area, potentially allowing for skull penetration and brain tissue damage, while avoiding the deeper brain structures that would cause immediate death. It's a horrible thing to analyze in this much detail, but it aligns perfectly with both Phone Guy's description and what we learned from the bite of 83 about the mechanics of these injuries. FNAF 4 also established that bite incidents don't require malicious intent or active hunting behavior from the animatronic. Fredbear wasn't trying to hurt the crying child. The tragedy occurred because the child was placed in a dangerous position relative to an animatronic mouth during what was probably normal operation or a triggered response. This supports theories about Mangle causing the bite of 87 through proximity and unfortunate timing, rather than through aggressive predatory attack. Perhaps someone was too close to Mangle in Kids Cove during the birthday party. Perhaps a child climbed up near where Mangle was hanging from the ceiling. Perhaps an employee, Jeremy, if he was the victim, was performing maintenance or trying to help someone retrieve something, and Mangle's jaws closed at exactly the wrong moment due to programming, motion sensors, or mechanical failure. The scenario doesn't require Mangle to be actively malicious, just dangerously positioned with powerful jaws that activate at the worst possible time. Toy Chica is the other leading suspect, and FNAF 4 provided indirect but significant support for this theory as well. Scott Cawthon's cryptic comment asking, "Why would the tiny toy Chica be missing her beak?" in reference to FNAF 4's minigames, suggested strongly that this detail was significant, that players should have been paying more attention to it. If Toy Chica's beak became lodged in someone's skull during a bite, that would perfectly explain its absence and would align exactly with what we learned about frontal lobe injuries from FNAF 4. A beak stuck in someone's forehead is precisely the kind of wound that could damage frontal brain tissue, while potentially allowing survival if medical intervention was fast enough. The lodged in your forehead of course voice line from Toy Chica in Ultimate Custom Night, released years later, seems to confirm this interpretation. While we need to be cautious about treating later games' hints as definitive proof of what Scott originally intended when making FNAF 2, this line is too specific, too on the nose to ignore. Combined with Scott's comment about the missing beak in FNAF 4, it suggests Toy Chica was at minimum seriously considered as the potential culprit. From what FNAF 4 taught us about bite positioning and injury patterns, Toy Chica's attack would need to come from roughly the same level as the victim's head to cause the specific frontal lobe damage Phone Guy described. This works if the victim was a child at roughly Toy Chica's height, or if an adult was bending down or kneeling to interact with children at the birthday party when Toy Chica approached. The scenario of someone kneeling to help a child or set up decorations or serve pizza, with Toy Chica programmed to approach and interact, and the interaction going catastrophically wrong, fits the pattern established by the bite of 83, where positioning and unfortunate timing combined with inadequate supervision led to tragedy. Now let's consider the suspects that FNAF 4 helped eliminate, or at least made significantly less likely, through the context it provided. The withered animatronics, withered Freddy, withered Bonnie, withered Chica, and withered Foxy were kept in the parts and service room throughout FNAF 2. Phone Guy explicitly mentions they're being kept in the back because they're kind of ugly and smell bad, and that the company is trying to retrofit them with newer technology. For these animatronics to have caused the bite of 87, they would have had to either escape parts and service during the day or be moved out specifically for the party event. The scenario FNAF 4 showed us makes this implausible. The bite of 83 occurred during normal restaurant operation, publicly, with multiple witnesses in a main area. For the bite of 87 to have had the impact Phone Guy describes, leading to major policy changes and significant damage to the company's reputation, it would need to have occurred similarly publicly during normal operations. An incident involving a withered animatronic that somehow escaped from a back room would certainly be concerning and dangerous, but it wouldn't necessarily indicate systemic problems with the standard operating procedure of animatronics interacting with guests. The policy change to restrict day roaming makes most sense if the incident involved an animatronic that was supposed to be interacting with guests as part of normal operations, not one that was already isolated and decommissioned. Balloon Boy can be completely, definitively eliminated as a suspect based on what FNAF 4 showed us about the mechanics of bite injuries. Despite being present at the FNAF 2 location and being creepy in his own way, Balloon Boy simply doesn't have a mouth capable of causing the injury Phone Guy describes. The positioning, the crushing force, the precision required for frontal lobe damage, None of this is remotely possible with Balloon Boy's design. He's essentially a small humanoid figure with a painted face, not an animatronic with functional jaws capable of generating bite force. The puppet is another suspect we can eliminate based on mechanical capability. While the puppet plays a crucial role in FNAF lore and was definitely present at the FNAF 2 location, their design doesn't include functional jaws capable of biting. The puppet's face is a mask with a painted expression. While they're certainly eerie and possibly dangerous in other ways, capable of stuffing bodies into suits, for instance, they couldn't cause the specific type of bite injury that occurred in the Bite of 87. What FNAF 4 taught us about the mechanics of bite injuries requires an animatronic with powerful, articulating jaws that can generate crushing force, which the puppet completely lacks. Golden Freddy presents an interesting but ultimately implausible case. As what appears to be a hallucination or spectral presence in FNAF 2, Golden Freddy doesn't seem to have physical form in the same way other animatronics do. While various theories exist about Golden Freddy being involved in different incidents across the franchise's timeline, the concrete physical nature of the Bite of 87, someone's frontal lobe was physically bitten off, there was real blood, there were multiple witnesses, there were immediate medical consequences, requires an animatronic that was physically present and capable of delivering an actual mechanical bite. Golden Freddy's supernatural or psychological qualities make them a poor fit for an incident that had such immediate, tangible, physical and medical consequences. Toy Freddy and Toy Bonnie are possible suspects, but considerably less likely than Mangle or Toy Chica. Both were main stage performers who had some degree of mobility and could potentially interact with guests. However, what FNAF 4 taught us about bite incidents strongly favors suspects who had specific reasons to be at head height or in very close proximity to guests during parties. The main stage animatronics would typically be performing at a distance on an elevated stage, not positioned where accidental bites during party activities would be likely. It's not impossible to construct scenarios where Toy Freddy or Toy Bonnie could have caused the bite, but these scenarios feel more forced, more contrived compared to Mangle in Kids Cove, with documented constant close contact with children, or Toy Chica potentially roaming between tables during dining service. The evidence and context point much more strongly toward Mangle or Toy Chica. The process of elimination matters tremendously because FNAF 4 gave us a clear framework for what's plausible versus what's merely possible. Before the game, theories about the Bite of 87 could involve almost any animatronic in almost any scenario because we lacked concrete information about how these incidents actually occur in the FNAF universe. But after seeing the Bite of 83 in detail, we understood that certain conditions were necessary: proximity to guests during daytime operation, positioning that allows for horizontal bite across the forehead, enough force to penetrate skull bone, but not so much chaos that the victim dies immediately, and a scenario that makes sense within the context of a birthday party environment with children and families present. Mangle fits all these criteria perfectly. They had the access through Kids Cove, the positioning through ceiling mounting and mobility, the jaw mechanics through their design, and documented close interaction with guests, especially children. Toy Chica fits most of them with the added evidence of the missing beak and later voice lines that seem to confirm involvement. The other suspects require significantly more elaborate explanations or scenarios that don't align as naturally with what we learn from FNAF 4 about how bite incidents actually happen. It's also worth considering what the different suspects tell us about Fazbear Entertainment's specific failures. If Mangle caused the Bite of 87, It highlights the danger of allowing children unsupervised access to animatronics, even in designated play areas. The company created a space where kids could pull Mangle apart and put them back together, which inherently meant extremely close contact with powerful mechanical parts, including jaws capable of tremendous bite force. That's a disaster waiting to happen, a recipe for tragedy that FNAF 4 helped us recognize by showing how dangerous such proximity can be. If Toy Chica caused it, it highlights the danger of having animatronics roam freely among tables during parties or dining service, interacting with guests without constant supervision. Toy Chica might have been programmed to walk around entertaining guests, delivering cupcakes, or interacting with children as part of the restaurant's appeal. But that programming wouldn't account for every possible scenario. What if someone falls and ends up at jaw height? What if a malfunction causes the jaws to close unexpectedly? What if the facial recognition system that's supposed to identify humans fails or gets tampered with, as Phone Guy warns about? The process of narrowing down suspects also reveals how much information Scott actually provided, even though it felt like he was withholding answers. By showing us the bite of 83 in detail, by giving us multiple games worth of context about the FNAF 2 location and its animatronics, by including little details like Toy Chica's missing beak that seemed insignificant at first, Scott gave us everything we needed to make informed, evidence-based theories about the bite of 87. The fact that we can have this discussion, that we can eliminate certain suspects with confidence and support others with logical reasoning based on established mechanics and context, shows that the mystery was actually solvable using the information provided. It wasn't arbitrary or impossible. The tools were there. We just needed to learn how to use them. Needed to understand that the answer to 1987 was hidden in the details of 1983. Some players might find it frustrating that Scott never definitively revealed which animatronic caused the bite of 87 in an explicit, undeniable way. But this approach has significant advantages that make the storytelling richer. It keeps the mystery alive, allowing for ongoing discussion and theory crafting in the community. It respects different interpretations while still providing enough framework that some theories are clearly more supported than others. It acknowledges that in real-life tragedies, sometimes the exact details remain unclear or disputed, even when the broad strokes of what happened are well understood. And it maintains the franchise's identity as a series that requires active engagement and deductive reasoning rather than passive consumption. FNAF 4's greatest contribution to solving the bite of 87 wasn't identifying the specific culprit with absolute certainty. It was giving us the tools to evaluate suspects intelligently, to understand what makes one theory more plausible than another based on evidence, to think critically about how these incidents occur, rather than just guessing randomly or going with gut feelings. Whether you believe it was Mangle, Toy Chica, or have another theory entirely, FNAF 4 ensured that your theory would be grounded in understanding of bite incident mechanics, positioning, context, and plausibility. That's how a mystery should work in sophisticated storytelling. Not just providing an answer and moving on, but providing the means to work toward an answer through logic, evidence, and careful analysis. The journey of solving the mystery, the discussions it generates, the way it brings a community together to share ideas and build on each other's insights. That's all part of the value, part of what makes a FNAF's approach to storytelling special and memorable. As we reach the end of this exploration into how FNAF 4 secretly solved the bite of 87, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the elegant complexity of what Scott Cawthon achieved with this game and this approach to storytelling. The solution to the franchise's greatest mystery wasn't hidden in obscure secrets or impossible to find Easter eggs. It was right there in the open, in the minigames we all played, in the details we all saw. We just needed time, patience, and the right perspective to understand what we were looking at and what it meant for the mystery we'd been chasing since the franchise began. The Bite of 87 has haunted FNAF players since Phone Guy first mentioned it in that casual aside during your first night shift back in 2014. We spent years theorizing, debating, analyzing every frame of every game, looking for clues about which animatronic did it, who the victim was, exactly how and when it happened. And in 2015, when FNAF 4 released and showed us the Bite of 83 instead of the Bite of 87 we expected, it felt like the mystery was going to remain unsolved forever, that Scott was withholding the answers we desperately wanted, that we'd never get the closure we'd been seeking. But the truth, the beautiful, brilliant truth that took months for the community to fully grasp, is that FNAF 4 did solve the Bite of 87. It solved it in a way that required us to think critically, to make connections across different games and time periods, to apply what we learned about one incident to understand another that we never directly witnessed, by showing us a Bite incident in complete detail, the fear leading up to it, the positioning and mechanics of how animatronic jaws cause specific injuries, the medical consequences and hospital aftermath, the emotional trauma for victims and witnesses, the company's inadequate response. Scott gave us a comprehensive template for understanding all Bite incidents in the FNAF universe. We learned that animatronic jaws can cause precise frontal lobe damage during daytime birthday parties when positioning aligns tragically, that victims can survive such catastrophic injuries even though the odds seem impossible, that Fazbear Entertainment's pattern of negligence allows these tragedies to repeat across years and locations because profit is prioritized over safety, and critically, that understanding one incident provides the essential context to solve another that's deliberately left more ambiguous. The genius of this approach lies in its profound respect for audience intelligence. Scott could have just shown us the Bite of 87 directly, could have given us a minigame or cutscene depicting exactly what happened with no room for interpretation. But instead, he taught us how to solve it ourselves by giving us all the pieces we needed and trusting that we'd eventually put them together correctly. That trust was ultimately rewarded. The community did figure it out, did make the necessary connections, did reach a sophisticated understanding of how FNAF 4 related to the earlier mystery, even though it took months of discussion and debate to get there. What we learned extends far beyond the specific question of which animatronic bit whom and when. We learned about institutional failure and how companies prioritize profit over human safety time and time again. We learned about how trauma echoes through families and communities, shaping futures in ways that can't be easily undone. We learned about how victims of tragedy are often failed by the very systems and institutions that should protect them. We learned that mysteries don't always need explicit answers to be deeply satisfying, that sometimes the journey of solving a puzzle collaboratively is more valuable than having it solved for us. And perhaps most importantly, we learned how to engage with FNAF's lore more broadly, more thoughtfully. The Bite of 87 mystery taught us that patience and careful analysis pay off in this franchise, that details matter enormously, that connecting events across different games and time periods is necessary for understanding the full story. It demonstrated that Scott Cawthon is a more sophisticated storyteller than he sometimes gets credit for, that his indirect approach serves genuine narrative purposes rather than being arbitrary mystery-mongering designed to frustrate fans. Looking at the franchise now with years of additional games, revelations and lore expansions, the Bite of 87 feels like it's in its proper place within the larger tapestry of FNAF's timeline. It's not the central mystery anymore. Newer games have introduced their own puzzles, their own horrors, their own questions that drive community discussion. But it remains an important piece of the timeline, a defining moment that shaped how Fazbear Entertainment operated going forward. A tragedy that helps us understand the broader patterns of failure that characterize this universe and make it so compelling to explore. And FNAF 4 remains a masterclass in indirect storytelling, in showing one thing to solve another, in trusting the audience to make connections rather than spelling everything out explicitly, by providing context instead of answers, by respecting our intelligence and engagement, by rewarding careful attention and thoughtful analysis. Scott created a game that continues to be discussed and analyzed years after release. The nightmare sections provide pure, intense horror gameplay that's tense and atmospheric and genuinely scary. But the minigames provide something even more valuable: context, understanding, the key to unlocking mysteries that extend far beyond the game itself. The journey from "this isn't what we wanted" to "this is exactly what we needed" mirrors the larger journey of the FNAF community's maturation. We've learned to appreciate oblique answers, to value the process of figuring things out collaboratively as a community, to trust that mysteries will be solvable even if they're not immediately obvious, to understand that sophisticated storytelling often requires patience and multiple perspectives to fully appreciate. So whether you're a long-time FNAF fan who lived through the chaos of FNAF 4's release and the months of confused theorizing that followed, experiencing the community's evolution in real time, or whether you're newer to the franchise and discovered these games after the major mysteries were already largely solved and explained in countless videos and wiki articles, I hope this exploration has helped you appreciate the cleverness of how FNAF 4 approached the Bite of 87. It's a perfect example of how thoughtful storytelling can surprise you, challenge your expectations, and ultimately reward you for paying attention and thinking critically about what you're being shown rather than just passively consuming content. The Bite of 87 may never be definitively, explicitly solved in a way that names the exact animatronic and victim beyond any possible doubt, with official confirmation from Scott that settles all debates forever. But we understand it now in all the ways that matter. We know how it happened, why it happened, what circumstances made it possible, what it meant for the franchise going forward, how it fits into the larger pattern of Fazbear Entertainment's failures. And we know these things because FNAF 4 taught us what we needed to know by showing us something we didn't expect to see, something that initially seemed like a disappointment but turned out to be the key to everything. That's the secret solution that was hiding in plain sight all along. Not in the game that showed us 1987, but in the game that showed us 1983. Not in explicit answers, but in the framework to find answers ourselves. Not in what was shown, but in what we learned to see. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of gaming's most fascinating mysteries. If you enjoyed this exploration of FNAF lore and storytelling, I'd really appreciate if you'd like and subscribe to the channel. It helps tremendously and lets me know you want more content like this. And please, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think it was Mangle or Toy Chica? Do you have your own theories about details we might have missed? Were you part of the community when FNAF 4 first released? I love hearing different perspectives and continuing these conversations even years after the games first came out. Whether you're drifting off to sleep now, letting these words wash over you as you settle into rest, with the mysteries of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza playing through your mind, or whether you've been actively listening and your thoughts are buzzing with connections and realizations and new ways of seeing the franchise's narrative. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring one of FNAF's most enduring mysteries. The story of how FNAF 4 secretly solved the Bite of 87 is ultimately a story about patience and trust. Scott's patience in waiting for the community to figure out what he was telling us, and his trust that we would eventually get there. It's about sophisticated storytelling that respects its audience. It's about communities coming together to solve puzzles that seem impossible at first. It's about being willing to let go of what you expected to find in favor of understanding what's actually there. Sweet dreams, and watch out for those nightmare animatronics lurking in the shadows of your room. After all, we now know exactly what they're capable of. Exactly what happens when those powerful jaws close on someone who can't escape in time. But at least, we finally understand the mystery that started it all. The bite that was mentioned in the first game, but solved by the fourth in the most unexpected, brilliant way possible. The Bite of 87 will always be part of FNAF's legacy. A reminder that the best mysteries aren't always solved with direct answers, but with context, patience, and community. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this journey.